digging into the parables for today. Does anybody have any questions about the parables from we looked at on Friday, or parables in general? Well, I have broken out the parables into the categories, several categories. Last class, I didn't get to the last two categories, so chances are we won't get there in this one either. Last Friday, we looked at what parables in general are, and then we looked at probably the largest category of these parables of the kingdom. And I think we only made it through to the net parable, and then I mentioned the growing seed because it fits in with the others, and we didn't get to these last two. That is okay because the parable of the 10 virgins can also fit over into eschatology, and so we'll get to that one when we get to eschatology. But I did want to briefly talk about this parable of the workers in the vineyard, because I did get to that in the other class last week. The parable of the workers in the vineyard, basically, if you know what a day laborer is somebody that goes and they just work for a day for whoever needs the work, whoever needs the help. That means that if they need help with some kind of construction project, then you'll help with the construction project. If they're cleaning out the shed, you'll help clean out the shed. If they're planting crops, you'll help them plant crops. It's basically it's unskilled labor that just somebody needs another set of hands to do something, and that's what you're going to do for the day. And there are agencies that help to handle this now. There's also places that you can go in some towns where people hang out, and you can go and pick up somebody to work for you for a day. And it tends to usually be people from immigrant communities or people that are just impoverished, and they need the money, and that's what they can do. But you can still get day laborers today, usually by another name. But in the first century world and previously, it was relatively common. There was a kind of significant number of people that worked as day laborers. And a day laborer would be paid kind of a really mediocre, like a really modest amount. In fact, it was about a denarius under Rome. That was kind of the typical wages, which was sometimes in the older versions was translated as a penny. But basically a denarius was about enough money to keep a roof over your head and buy food for a day. It was nothing extra. It was just enough to survive. But in this story, Jesus tells a story of an owner of a vineyard that is looking to hire some help to tend the vineyard or to harvest grapes, whatever the work in the vineyard is. So he needs some laborers to work in his vineyard. And so he goes to where the day laborers are gathered, and he gathers up a group of them and agrees with them to pay them the denarius for the day, to pay them the standard wages for the day, and takes them back and lets them out into the vineyard, and the laborers begin working. Well, a few hours later, the owner of the vineyard is back in town, and he's back where the day laborers are gathered, and he notices that there's still a pretty good crowd of laborers there that haven't been picked up and haven't been hired for the day. And so he goes and he gathers up a group of them and says, "Look, come and work for me, and at the end of the day, I'll pay you whatever's fair." And so, first group he agreed to a denarius, and then the next group, when he comes and picks them up later, says, "I'll pay you whatever's fair." He takes them back, they agree to it, and he releases them, and they start working in the vineyard, and they're working alongside the others. A little later, around lunchtime, he goes back out and he drives back by, or he goes back by and he sees that there's still laborers standing around looking for work. And so he grabs another group of them and says, "Look, if you'll come to work for me, I'll pay you whatever's fair at the end of the day." And so they go, they work in his vineyard as well. And then finally, about an hour before quitting time, he goes and sees that there's still a few guys standing around looking for work. And so he tells all of them, gathers all of them up and says, "Look, if you'll come and work for me until quitting time, I'll pay you whatever's fair." And so he gathers all of them up and brings them, and they all go work in the vineyard. And so now he's got 4 different sets of workers that have come in at 4 different times during the day. Some have been there all day, some have been there for about an hour. And the end of the day comes, it's quitting time, it's the end of the labor day, and he starts to bring everybody in to pay them their wages. And he starts with those that were gathered last, those that have been there for about an hour. And as they're coming through, he pulls out a denarius and pays each of them the full wages for a day. gives them the wages for a full day, just like they had been there all day long. And so he pays them this full denarius. And then the second group comes through, the ones that have been there for a little less than half the day, came in after lunch, pays them a denarius, gives them a full day's wages, even though they worked a little less than half. And then the third group comes by, the group that was, picked up a few hours into the morning, and so they've been there probably 2/3 of the day, something like that. And he pays them a full day's wages. And when the first group sees this, they see all these people getting paid a denarius, they start to get excited and think, well, if he's paid them a full denarius for a partial day, he must be planning on giving us extra. He must be planning on paying us well. And so as they come through, they're getting excited, and then the master hands them a denarius, pays them the full day's wages, and sends them on. Well, they get mad now. It's like, why are you giving us the same that you gave everybody else when they didn't work as long as we did? We worked the whole day, and you didn't give us any extra? And the master's reply, the owner's reply, is basically, it's my money. You got what you agreed to. You got what you contracted for. I paid you what you were owed. It's my money. If I want to be generous with the others, I can be generous with the others. What do you have to complain about? Well, Jesus' point in this parable is that God can be generous with people if he wants to. And the people of Israel, the Jewish people and the Jewish leaders, they had made a covenant with God in ages past. I mean, their forefathers have made a covenant with God that if they will do this, if they will obey the law, if they will be faithful to God, God will give them these things, a land and a blessing and people, generations of descendants. And the people will be great. And that God would send the Messiah. The Messiah would come to them. They had been given these promises. If they were faithful to the law, God would do all these things. And God had done all those things. They had received what they were promised. And so they had no reason. Now they were complaining, or that they puffed themselves up and thought that if God is going to let all of these people that aren't Jewish, all these Gentiles, into the promises and give them the rewards, then he must be going to do something extra for us. He's going to do more for us. We're going to be in charge in the kingdom of God. We're going to be the top dogs in the kingdom of God. Jesus was saying, no, you have got what you promised, and if God gives the same thing to others, what's that to you? God can be generous to whoever God wants to be generous to. God can extend grace to whoever God wants to extend grace to. You have no reason to complain if God is generous to someone else, or to expect that God is going to give you more if God is generous to someone else. So that was the point, or kind of basically the point of the workers in the vineyard story, of the parable. And with parables, there's always the potential that just one meaning doesn't cover it. That there's more layers of meaning than just the first level obvious one. And so you can profit from going and deeply studying these parables, even after being given the kind of basic meaning, the kind of first blush meaning. And so don't think that because I'm telling you, on the kind of first glimpse meaning of the parable, that's it. You're done. You understand it. There's nothing else for you to do with them. There's lots of layers of meanings and parables that you can tease out if you continue to study them, especially study them together. But that's it for the workers in the vineyard, or what I shared. So now with the other classes, so now we're going to move over to the first big category over here, or new category, the parables of love and forgiveness. And the first of those is called the parable of the two debtors, and this is from Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. And this one arises out of a particular situation. There's a particular moment, and Jesus uses this parable to illustrate a point, or teach a point in this situation. It's Luke chapter 7, it starts with verse 36. And the situation is basically a Pharisee has invited Jesus to dinner, and Jesus has come to dinner, and he's sitting there at the table with this Pharisee eating dinner. And while he's sitting there at the table eating dinner, this woman comes in, and this woman is, she has a bad reputation. She's done some things that aren't right or aren't good, and she's ruined her reputation. People think very poorly of her, think she's a sinner. But she comes in and she falls down at Jesus' feet, and Jesus is reclining at the table. Typically you sat on the floor and kind of leaned over and reclined at the table when you were eating. So Jesus is there reclined at the table, and his feet are kind of out to the side, And this woman falls down at his feet and just starts weeping and crying. And her tears are falling on Jesus' feet. And she's using she takes her hair down and uses her hair as like a brush or a washcloth to clean Jesus' feet off. And then she takes a jar of expensive, precious perfume and pours it out over Jesus' feet. And as she's doing this, Jesus is looking at her, and the Pharisee is sitting at the head of the table, and he starts thinking to himself, if he was really a prophet, if he was really from God, he would know what kind of woman this is. He would know about her sins and her problems and her bad reputation. He would know who she was, and he wouldn't let her touch him like that. And Jesus replies to what he's thinking. The Pharisee didn't actually say this out loud. Simon is his name, Simon the Pharisee. Simon is a very common name. He's thinking this in his head, and Jesus replies to it as though he said something out loud. And so Jesus starts to tell this story about these two debtors. He says there was a man that loaned money. This guy, he's a money lender. And there are these two men that owe him money. And one owes 50 denarii, and the other owes 500 denarii. Now, I just told you that a denarii with the last story, with the laborers, that a denarii is about a day's wages. And so one is about 2 months' wages, about 50 days worth, almost 2 months' wages. And the other is 10 times that, and so most of a year's wages. And so if you want to break that out into something, more our time, then think something like one owes $50,000 and the other owes $5,000. And so this is, these two men each owe an amount of money, and it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's a chunk of money. But one owes 10 times as much as the other. And the moneylender has loaned these two men this money, and it turns out now neither one of them have the money to repay. The loan is due, they're supposed to be paying, and they have no money. They can't repay. And the moneylender, in very not moneylender fashion, very, very contrary to most of our most experience with people that are companies that lend money, the moneylender takes pity on them. He has compassion for them, and he forgives both of their debt. Neither one of them have to repay their debt. And so these two men, both of them owe a chunk of money. One of them owes 10 times as much as the other. And when they can't pay, the moneylender just forgives them and lets them go. And then Jesus looks at the Pharisee and says, which one do you think loves his benefactor, loves the moneylender more? Well, which one would you think? The one who owed more. Exactly what Simon the Pharisee says. The one who had the larger debt forgiven. And Jesus says, look at this woman. This woman that came in to wash my feet. When I came in, you didn't give me any water to wash my feet. But this woman has not stopped, has wept over and washed my feet with her tears and her hair. You didn't give me any oil for my head, but this woman has poured out expensive perfume on my feet. She knows that she has been forgiven much. She knows how much she has done wrong, and because of her experience of forgiveness, she loves much. And those that are forgiven much love much. And then he turns and looks at the woman and says, your sins are forgiven. And then, of course, they're mad at him for saying your sins are forgiven. But, that's typical at this point. And so the point of the parable of the two debtors, the meaning that you get from it, is that those that are forgiven more, that have a greater sense of their unworthiness or their sinfulness when they are forgiven, tend to have a greater love for and attachment to and reverence for, that they have greater faithfulness after that. The one that is forgiven the greater debt tends to love the one that forgives them more. And those that have very little sense that they've done anything wrong or are very confident in their own righteousness don't generally love very much because they don't feel like they have been forgiven very much. So that's the first one, the first in the love and forgiveness category. And then the second is probably one of the best known parables in the Bible, one of the best known parables of Jesus. It's called the Good Samaritan, and it too comes out of a particular situation, a particular moment. And actually, this parable is so well known, even by people that aren't like reading the Bible regularly or aren't in church regularly. This parable is well known enough that there's some confusion around it. A lot of people think that instead of this being a parable that Jesus tells to prove a point or to make a point, they think that it's actually a historical event that is recorded in the Bible. That's a confusion. Jesus is not saying that this actually happened at some point. He is constructing a story and telling his disciples, or telling the people around him, telling the story in order to make a point. And the situation that this parable arises out of, or that it comes from, is Jesus is talking to another expert in the law, not a Pharisee, but someone that has some authority, has been teaching the law to others, and is considered an expert, maybe a scribe. And the scribe comes to Jesus and asks, "Teacher, what should I do, or what must I do to inherit eternal life? What do I have to do to get eternal life?" And Jesus replies, and he's a teacher of the law, an expert in the law. So Jesus replies and says, "Well, you know the law. What does it say? How do you read it?" And the teacher of the law replies and gives Jesus' two greatest commandments, the two commandments that Jesus has been saying are the greatest when he's challenged. And so he says to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus' reply is basically, you've got it. Go and do it. That's it. Your answer is good. Go, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. That's what Jesus says. And the teacher of the law replies and says that he wants to justify himself, which in this context, if the probable meaning here is that he realizes that to love your neighbor as yourself is a big undertaking, and so he wants to limit the number of people that are in the category neighbor that he has to do this for. And so if he can define down neighbor enough, maybe he can actually do this whole love your neighbor as yourself thing. And so he says, well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus starts to tell a story. He says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jericho is about 20 or so miles east of Jerusalem, down near the Jordan River. It's a good a hard day's walk, right? You could get there if you leave in the morning. You could walk there. If you walk all day, you could get there before nightfall. You can actually walk 20 miles in a day if you have to. Most of us haven't done that, but it is possible. And so it's a good most of a day's walk to get to Jericho. And Jesus is saying, there's this man going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and if he's coming from Jerusalem going to Jericho, there's a pretty good chance that this is a Jewish man. But we're not actually told. Jesus doesn't actually say he's Jewish. He just presents him as a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and so quite possibly, probably Jewish. And so as he's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, he falls into the hands of robbers. There are brigands, robbers that have set up on the side of the road on the way down to Jericho. They're hiding in some caves or something. And when this man starts to pass by, they jump out and they grab him and they strip him naked. They steal all of his clothing, all of his valuables, and they beat him and nearly kill him and then leave him there on the side of the road to die. And then they go on and enjoy their dishonest gains. And a little while later, a priest from the temple in Jerusalem, one of the Jewish priests, comes walking by, and he looks and he sees the man there, right on the side of the road in the ditch, and so he walks by on the opposite side of the road. He steps by to get as far away from him as he can, and he walks by on the opposite side of the road. And a little while later, a Levite comes by, and Levites are from the tribe of Levi, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and specifically is the tribe that was not given any land, but was given cities in everybody else's land, and they were given religious duties instead. And so instead of being given land to work, land as their inheritance, they were given cities within everybody else's land, and they had all of these religious and ritual obligations, and all of the priests were supposed to come from the tribe of Levi, but not all Levites were priests. They were all supposed to have religious duties, but they weren't all priests. And so this Levite is another religious leader, another religious figure. And this Levite comes walking down the road, and when he sees the man in the ditch, laying there, he also walks by on the opposite side of the road, gets as far away from him as he can, and continues on his journey. Now, the reason that these two religious leaders, the priest and the Levite, might do this in context is that if they look and they see this man in the ditch, if he's not moving, there's a good chance he's already dead. And if they go over and check on him and they touch him in order to check on him, then they have touched a dead body, which makes them unclean, and so they can't do their religious obligations and their religious responsibilities until they are purified, until a period goes by and they go through the purification rites. And that's, the religious leaders would, they try not to make themselves unclean because then they can't fulfill their religious obligations. And so they walk by on the opposite side of the road to pass him by. And then a Samaritan goes by. And remember who the Samaritans are. Actually, almost everybody did real well on the test on this question about the Samaritans, the last of the multiple choice questions. It was a description of the Samaritans, and the correct answer was Samaritans, and almost everybody got it right. There were very, very few that got that one wrong. So I think everybody pretty well has an idea of who the Samaritans were, but they were the group that was hated and despised or rejected by the Jewish people in general because they were not fully Jewish and not fully Gentile. They had mixed Jewish ancestry, so they were a mixed race, and they also used a corrupted and mixed version of Jewish worship. And so they had a very kind of twisted up version of Jewish rituals and Jewish worship, and they had a mixed racial background, which for the Jewish people was a problem. And so the Jewish people did not like the Samaritans at all. And here comes, Jesus has in his story, here comes the Samaritan walking down the road. And when the Samaritan sees the man lying in the ditch, half dead, he goes over to check on him, and he takes pity on him. And so he bandages his wounds, and he pours on oil and wine. And the wine with the alcohol in it would have worked as a disinfectant. It helped to keep wounds from getting infected and causing all kinds of other problems. And then the oil would have helped kind of promote healing as well. It was kind of folk remedy. It's what they had. So he pours on oil and wine, and then he takes the man and he puts him on his own donkey. And so instead of getting to ride to where he's going, now the Samaritan or man is walking and leading this donkey with the man on it to get him to the next town. And when he gets him to the town, he unloads him and takes him into the inn and stays with him there and takes care of him overnight. And the next day, when the Samaritan man has to leave, he goes to the innkeeper and he pays him extra money and says, look, take care of this man that I brought in. And if taking care of him costs you more than I'm leaving, more than these 2 coins, I will repay you when I come back through. And so he makes sure, this Samaritan man takes pity on him, bandages him up, carries him to town, takes care of him all night long, and then when he leaves, he makes sure that he's taken care of, even if it ends up costing him a lot of money later. And then Jesus, after telling all this story, and he turns to the guy that started all this, the teacher of the law that started all this, and says, which one was a neighbor, which of the 3, the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, which of the 3 was a neighbor to the man who'd been robbed? Well, the obvious answer was the Samaritan. And so the teacher of the law says, the man who had pity on him. And you note that the teacher of the law could not actually bring himself to say the Samaritan is the good guy. He's still got some racial prejudice here. He doesn't like the Samaritans, and so he can't bring himself to say the Samaritan did it. The Samaritan is the neighbor. But he says the man that took pity on him was the neighbor. And then Jesus simply says, go and do likewise. And the implication of the story is, the meaning at very base level is that if you're asking who is my neighbor in this, love your neighbor as you love yourself, you're obligated to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and you say, who is my neighbor? The answer is whoever you meet that's in need. Whoever they are. I mean, the Samaritan had no connection, no contact with this man. We don't even know what the man's background was. All we know is that the Samaritan saw a man in need and helped. And so, anyone that you meet is your neighbor. Regardless of what other things may separate you, race or background or gender or culture or whatever, no other separations matter. Anyone that you meet that is in need is your neighbor. Love them as you love yourself. So that's the Good Samaritan, and like I said, that's probably the best known parable of Jesus. Most people recognize that one, or a lot of people recognize that one that have never entered a church and never really opened the Bible. It's just a story that is out there and relatively commonly referred to. And then finally we have the last one in this category is the parable of the unmerciful servant. This one is out of Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18, and it too comes out of a particular instance, a particular situation. In this case, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he is teaching them about forgiveness, and Peter replies, and Peter asks Jesus a question. He says, Lord, how many times should I forgive a brother or sister who does something against me, who harms me or sins against me? And then Peter offers a suggestion, up to 7 times? Should I forgive them 7 times? And in Matthew, Jesus replies, not 7, but 77. And then I think it's in Luke that Jesus replies, not 7, but 70 times 7, which would be 490 for you, math teachers. Either way, the point seems to be that you can count to 7, but it's harder to count to 77 when you're actually forgiving somebody. If you're not actually hanging on to a grudge about something, it's hard to remember 77 instances of them wronging you or doing something against you. And so the number 77 versus 70 times 7 is actually kind of irrelevant. The point is a big number that you're never going to get to if you're actually forgiving people. And so he says not 7 times, but 77 times. And then he goes on to tell a story to illustrate the point, to make sure that the point is clear. And so he tells the story of a king that he has servants and people that work for him, people that he has entrusted with various parts of his kingdom and various amounts of wealth to try to make more money and to basically just take care of the kingdom. And so this king has decided it's time to take accounts, to make sure that his servants are actually doing what they're saying they're doing, and to make sure that they are actually taking care of what he's entrusted them. And so he calls all of his servants in and has them give an account for what they have been entrusted with. And one of the servants, when he comes in, the story says that after the settlement, he owes the king, the king has found that this man has lost or embezzled 10,000 bags of gold. That's the newer English translation. The older was 10,000 talents of gold. And a talent is a significant hunk of weight. There's a couple of different measures that are given for a talent, and talents could vary in different times and places exactly how much they weighed. But the breakdown is that a talent of gold would have been equivalent to about 20 years' wages for that day labor we've been talking about. So about 20 years worth of being paid a denarius a day. And so this is 20 years' wages, which if you are talking about, one talent is about 20 years' wages. And if you're talking about somebody now that makes, let's make the math easy and say that you make $50,000 a year, that's kind of on the upper end for somebody that's not well paid, right? That's more than most people are going to get if they're not well paid. But let's make it the easy math. If you're making $50,000 a year, 20 years of that would be $1 million. Well, this guy has 10,000 of that. He has lost and squandered 10,000 of that. And so we're talking about hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars that the servant has lost or embezzled or squandered. And so the king calls him in to give an account, and he has lost $1 billion. What is he going to do? And so the king demands that he pay it back. And of course, you can't just pay back $1 billion, right? Nobody can just pay back $1 billion unless you're in the top, the very top, most wealthy people in the world. And so he's, I don't have the money. And so the king orders that he and his wife and all of his children be sold into slavery to repay the debt. And then the man falls down on his knees and starts to beg for time. To give me a second chance, give me time. I'll repay everything if you just give me time. I don't know what I would have to do to repay $1 billion. That ain't happening, right? My entire lifetime doing everything that I could buy, borrow, steal, or any way I could make money, could not pay it back $1 billion. But he is begging for more time to repay this $1 billion that he owes. And the king looks at him and has compassion on him. And he says, forget it. And forgives his debt and lets him go. Well, that servant, having just been forgiven this $1 billion debt, goes out and finds another servant that owes him money. And the amount that he owes is about 100 denarii. 100 denarii, which is, again, about 100 days' wages. It's a few $1,000s. And he goes and he finds this servant that owes him some money, and he grabs him around the throat and starts to choke him and says, "Pay me what you owe me." And the servant, like the second servant, the one that owes the first servant money, just like the first servant before the king, says, "I don't have it, give me more time, and I promise I'll pay you back what I owe." a few $1,000s you can actually repay with some steady work over a reasonable amount of time. You can pay back a few $1,000s in a year if you work and save and make that your purpose, your point. That's how you're going to do it. And so he says, give me time and I will repay you. But the first servant, the one that's just been forgiven this huge debt, refuses to show him mercy. And so he goes out and takes him to court and has him thrown in debtor's prison, where he will have to stay until he can repay the debt. Well, the other servants hear what has happened. Other servants standing around hear what has happened, and it makes them angry. And so they go and they tell the king, and the king is now incensed. And so he calls the first servant in, brings him back in, and he says, you wicked servant, I just forgave you all of that debt, and you turn around and show no mercy and refuse to forgive someone that owes you, another servant that owes you so little. And in his anger, the king takes the man, the servant, and has him thrown in prison and tortured until he can pay everything back, which he'll never be able to do. And then Jesus ends the story, or ends this parable, and says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And basically what Jesus is saying is, if you want to be forgiven, you have to forgive. And if you are forgiven, if you recognize, if you realize the debt that has been paid on your behalf, or the debt that God has forgiven you, you will forgive others. It makes no sense to be the recipient of a great mercy or a great forgiveness and then refuse to forgive others what they owe you or their debts against you. And so if you are holding a grudge against someone else, if you are able to count to 7 or to 77 or to 490, to count the number of times that somebody has wronged you, then you aren't really forgiving them. You don't realize how much you have been forgiven. And so that's the parable of the unmerciful servant about forgiveness. You have been forgiven much, and so forgive others when they wrong you, when they owe you. So that's the love and forgiveness category. And then there's also, we have this prayer and relationship with God category. The first story comes from Matthew chapter 21, and then the second story, the wicked tenants, is right after it. But the first story, the two sons, in this story, Jesus says there's a man that has two sons, and a farmer, a landowner, has two sons, and he says to the first one, I need you to go out and work in the fields today. I need you to go out and do something on the farm today, out in the fields today. And the first son says, okay, I'll do it. But then he drags around the house all day, and he never goes and does what the father asked him to do. The whole day goes by, and he never goes out to the field to do what the father asked him to do. The father goes to the second son also that day and says, son, I need you to go and do this thing in the fields for me. I need you to go out and work in the fields today. And the second son says, I'm not going out in the fields today. No. But later he thinks better of it. He realizes, whatever, that he really ought to do what his father asks, or he reconsiders, and he goes out and he actually does what the father asked him to do out in the field. And then Jesus asks, which one did what the father wanted? Which one did the father's will? The first son or the second son? Well, obviously the answer is the second son. Even though the second son refused to go, said that he wouldn't go, he did actually go and do it. Whereas the first son just said, yeah, I'll go and do it, and said the words, but then never actually went and obeyed, never actually did the action, never actually did what the father wanted. And so which one did the father's will? The second son. And the point of this parable is that basically that just lip service, or just saying that you'll do things, or just saying the right words is not what the father actually wants. The father really wants obedience. And what God expects is for us to do what's right, not just to talk about it. And in this specific context he's speaking to Jewish religious leaders, the point also is that God is going to allow, God is accepting other children outside of Israel, because people of Israel, specifically the religious leaders of Israel, they know what they're supposed to do. They've been given the law, the prophets have come to them, they have all of the commands of God, all the regulations, they have all the promises, they know what they're supposed to do, and often they just don't do it. And so God is going to accept many that have rejected him in the past, because they will actually obey when God sends the Son of Man, when Jesus comes. And then God will accept all these people that have rejected him in the past, because now they're actually obeying. And so that's the first one. God doesn't just want lip service, he wants obedience. Okay? The parable of the two sons. The parable of the wicked tenants, in this story, a man sets up a vineyard and then he hires it out or rents it out to tenants, renters, to work, to do the final little bit of work on the land and to harvest the crops, harvest the grapes. And then the agreement is, and this is a common thing even now in agriculture, the agreement is that they will work the land and they will give a percentage of the produce or a percentage of the profits to the owner and then keep the rest as their portion. And I have, my church has several people that do farming as, for a living, or at least on the side. And between, all of them, they work a few thousand acres of land every year. But they actually only own a small percentage of that. Most of the land that they work is actually owned by other families. It's kind of been passed down to other families, and they rent the land from them, and in exchange they give either a portion of the produce, the grain or corn or whatever they grow on the land. They give a portion of the produce to the person that owns the land, or they give, when they sell it, they give a portion of the money, a portion of the profits. And that's a very common arrangement in agriculture, to rent out land to be farmed. And that's basically what's happening here. But in this case, the owner of the land has done almost all of the work. The owner of the land planted a vineyard, and it actually takes about 3 years for grapevines to grow to the point that they can produce a decent crop. And for the first 2 years, basically, you just count on not getting any grapes. You're pretty much not. And so the owner plants the grapevines, and over the course of the next 2 years, does all of this other work to set it up. He builds a wall around the vineyard. He puts a watchtower in the vineyard so that they can watch and see, any animals that are trying to come in, or they can use the watchtower to shoot down birds that are coming to eat up the grapes and all that kind of stuff. And he digs a wine press. The wine press was typically dug into rock, and it was basically a kind of a trough that they could put grapes in and stomp it to crush out the grape juice. And then there'd be kind of a lower trough that the grape juice would run out of as the grapes were crushed. And so he does all of this work, digs the wine press, and has everything ready to take the first crop and produce wine from it. And so all the tenants really have to do is come in and kind of tend the grapevines for a year, make sure that they grow, and then collect that first harvest, because we're 2 years in at this point. They're ready to produce. And so he hires up the land to these tenants, and they come in and they do the work for the year, they harvest the grapes. And so the landowner sends servants to come and collect the portion of the produce that belongs to the owner, the rent. And when they get there, the tenants mistreat them, curse at them, abuse them, insult them, and then drive them away. They won't let them in. And so the master sends more servants to insist on getting the rent. And this group, they beat and curse at, and they even kill some. And the master says, well, surely they have rejected my servants, they haven't listened to my servants, but surely they'll respect my son. And so the master sends his own son to come and to collect the rent. But when the tenants see the son coming, they say, that's the son, that's the owner's son, he's the heir, let's kill him and take his inheritance. That's their plan, and they do it. When the son gets there to collect the rent, they kill him and they throw his body out over the wall. Now, there is no legal system that I'm aware of, either currently or anywhere in history, where you can kill someone and that entitles you to their inheritance. This was a stupid plan, and it doesn't work out for them, right? I mean, this could not work in any culture anywhere in the world that I know of at any time in history. But it's the plan that they make, and they follow it through. They kill the son and throw his body out. And then Jesus turns and looks at the people that are gathered around. He looks at the crowds, and he says, what will the owner do with those tenants? And the people yell out, or someone in the crowd yells out, he'll put those wretches to a wretched end. Basically, he's going to kill them and give the vineyard to somebody else. Somebody that'll actually pay him what he's owed and not mistreat his servants and not kill his son. He'll kill those wretched tenants and give it to somebody else. And Jesus' point, the point of the story is, and the Pharisees that were listening really got the point of the story, they were the wicked tenants. The Pharisees were the wicked tenants, or the religious leaders, the Jewish people, and especially the religious leaders were the wicked tenants. The leaders of Israel were the ones that had repeatedly, despite being given everything that they needed, despite God's hand in producing their prosperity and blessing them and giving them all that they had and all that they needed, the religious leaders and the civic leaders, the kings of Israel, were the ones that persecuted the prophets and rejected their messages, refused to listen to what the prophets had to say, and even mistreated and killed some of the prophets. And now, finally, that the Master has sent his Son, Jesus, they are going to kill him too. And this is obviously before he dies, before Jesus is crucified. And so he is, telling them basically, this is what you're about to do to me. And so he tells them, this is what you're going to do. And then what do you think is going to happen to them? The land will be given to others. And the implication seems to be the idea gets picked up by Christian commentators later that Jesus was foretelling. Basically, he was telling them that because of what they were done, God was going to open up the kingdom and give the leadership of the kingdom of God to others, to not Jewish people. And that ended up being, the church. Now, please don't take any of this as being justification for anti-Semitism or any kind of violence or harm against Jewish people. That is not what this is. But a particular group of Jewish leaders in the first century, Jesus was telling the leadership, or the kind of leadership over the kingdom of God that has been entrusted to you up until this point, God is about to cause to pass to someone else because you have mismanaged it, because you have not handled it rightly. So that's the parable of the wicked tenants. And actually this could go in several, this parable could go in several different categories. It's somewhat about relationship with God, and that, you can't mistreat his servants. But it also kind of belongs in eschatology, because it has to do with God's judgment over those that have mistreated his servants. And then also about the kingdom of God, because it's about the leadership of the kingdom being kind of passed on to a different group. And so there's several categories that this wicked tenants could fall into. And you can actually say that about several of them. So some of these categories are somewhat arbitrary, but this one especially could belong in several different places. Then there's two more parables, the friend in the night and the persistent widow. And these both basically have the same meaning. They have the same purpose. In the first one, Jesus says, imagine that you have a friend, and that friend that friend lives next door to you, and in the middle of the night, late one night, you have somebody come and show up at your door that you have been expecting, but you didn't expect tonight, and they're hungry. Travelers come to stay with you, and they are hungry, and you look in your cupboards, and you don't have enough to feed them. And you've got some stuff, you can make some sandwiches, but you don't have any bread. And so you go over next door to where your friend lives. It's around midnight, and you start pounding on the door to get your friend to come to the door and give you some bread so that you can make your traveler, your guest, some sandwiches. He wasn't literally saying sandwiches, it was just bread. I'm modernizing a bit here. But you pound on the door, and your friend shouts out and says, "What do you want? Go away, I'm in bed." And you say, "Come and open the door, I need some bread. Somebody's come to stay, I need some bread." And your friend says, "I'm not getting out of bed, I'm already laying down, the kids are in bed with me. If I get up, it's going to wake everybody up." No, I'm not getting up. But you just keep pounding on the door. And eventually, as you pound on the door, eventually your friend gets up and comes and lets you in and gives you what you want just to get rid of you. Right? And Jesus says, if your friend, if this person would get up in the middle of the night and give you what you want just because you've annoyed them enough, how much more will your Father who actually cares about you, the Father who loves you, answer your prayers if you will persist in prayer? And so the point of the parable, the friend in the night, is pray persistently. Don't give up in prayer. Just keep praying, keep coming back, and keep asking God for what you need, and trust that God will give it to you when the time's right. And the same point is there for the persistent widow. In the parable of the persistent widow, there's a woman, a widow who has been wronged by a neighbor, and she goes to a judge to have the judge give an order that the neighbor pay them back, make restitution. But at this point, judges, well, there were only so many of them, and they didn't necessarily want to hear cases that weren't going to profit them, if they weren't going to make any money off of it. And so if you couldn't pay the judge to hear your case, the case may not ever get heard. And this judge keeps refusing, he refuses to hear the case. And so the widow just keeps coming back day after day and bothering him until eventually this corrupt judge who refuses to hear her case because he won't make any money off of it, eventually says, "Fine, I'll hear your case just to get rid of you, just to get you to leave me alone." And the judge hears her case and gives her what she's owed. And Jesus says, again, basically, if this man, this unjust judge, this corrupt judge, will listen to this woman, will give in and give her what she needs because she just won't stop asking, how much more will your Father in heaven, who actually cares about you, hear and answer your prayers if you don't give up? You just keep coming back and keep praying. And so both of these have the point, be persistent in prayer. Don't just pray once and then, give up on God answering your prayers. Pray consistently. Come back and persist in prayer and trust that God will hear you and will respond when the time is right. And then finally, there's the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's the last one in this category. I've got the Pharisee and the tax collector. And in this story, or this parable, Jesus posits or describes a day in the temple that there's these two men there praying, and one is a Pharisee and one is a tax collector. And the Pharisee looks around and he looks over and he sees this tax collector and he kind of sneers at him. And then he starts to pray and he says, "Oh God, thank you that I am not like this tax collector over here. Thank you that I am faithful and I obey your commands, and I fast weekly, I fast often, and I pray daily, and I give a tenth of all that I have, I pay my tithe, that I do all of these religious things, I fulfill all these religious obligations. Thank you that I am this good and righteous man and not like this Pharisee over here." And then the Pharisee, on the other hand, doesn't even have the courage or doesn't have the wherewithal to lift his head and arms towards heaven. Instead, he just sits and beats on his chest and says, "Have mercy on me, a sinner. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus says, that day, the tax collector goes home justified, and the Pharisee does not. The tax collector is accepted, and the Pharisee is not. And so basically the meaning or the point of the prayer is that the tax collector comes not expecting that God owes him anything, not expecting that he is good enough or that he is righteous enough to deserve to come to God and pray. He doesn't come with any expectations or trying to put God in any form of obligation. He just comes in humility and hoping for mercy, begging for mercy. And God hears his prayer and accepts him. But the Pharisee comes in self-righteousness, certain that he is right, certain that he's good, touting all of his religious, the things that he does and all of his religious credentials and how good a guy he is, and he is rejected. God doesn't care about his religious credentials. God accepts and appreciates or accepts and receives the humility and the cry for mercy from the tax collector, but rejects the self-righteousness and the confidence of the Pharisee. And so how should you approach God? In humility, not in self-righteousness. Yeah, there's no way we have time to do all of these. So I'm going to do the first two and just know that these three come together, and then we'll stop and we'll pick up the last one on Wednesday. And these three under redemption, these three are actually in one chapter of Luke. It's Luke chapter 15, and actually these three are the entire Luke chapter 15, and they all have a kind of a common theme between them. In the first one, that we have a lost sheep, and Jesus says, which one of you, if you had 100 sheep out in the pasture, you had 100 sheep out in the field, if one of them was lost, which one of you would not leave the 99 there in the pasture and go and find the one that was lost and bring them home? And when you had found them, bring them home and celebrate. Throw a party about the fact that you had found them. And then this woman, a woman has 10 coins, 10 silver coins, and one of them is lost in the house. Well, how many of you would not take and wouldn't tear the house apart, clean everything, clean all that everything until you found it, sweep up the whole house until you found the missing coin, and then throw a party with your friends, call friends over and throw a party to celebrate having found the one lost coin. Now, part of this here is both of those are a little over the top, right? I mean, leaving 99 healthy sheep in the field out and about while you go try to find the one that's lost, that's risky. Something could happen to the 99 while the shepherd's gone. But that is actually a thing that shepherds would commonly would do. They would go and find that one sheep. They would typically make sure that the rest of the flock was secure first, but Jesus says, which one of you would not leave your 99 in the field and go and find the one that was lost, and then celebrate the one that was lost coming back? And then the coin, by the time she throws a celebration, she spent more than the coin is worth in order to have the party about finding the coin. And so both of those kind of stop, they don't make so much sense. Jesus they're kind of over the top. And then the last one is the son. And it's called the parable of the lost son, but it's also called the prodigal son. And the prodigal son is how most people probably know it better. And he tells the story of a man that has two sons, and one of them goes away and is lost and wastes the family fortune. And we'll talk about that. We'll pick up with it on Wednesday. Thank y'all. We'll see you on Wednesday. If any of you have not taken the exam, today is the day. You gotta arrange with me to take the exam, because this is 1 week out and I'm returning them on Wednesday. Just one.
Are we going to make it up? Are we taking it?
No, if you did not take it, today is the last chance to arrange with me to take it. If you don't arrange with me to take it today, you'll end up with a 0.
Can I retake it?